Welcome back, degenerates, degeneritas, and you lottie of degenerates to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 308, Topuria versus Holloway. I think this is probably the deepest card of the year, including UFC 299 and 300, if we're being honest. I think every single one of these main card fights could qualify as a 5-round main event. That includes Shara Magomedov versus Armen Petrosyan, which, given some of the Apex slop we've been served up this year, wouldn't you rather see that than the two Marcin Tybura main events that we've gotten at the Apex this year? I certainly would. But it's only 3 rounds, and we'll get into that a little bit later. I've got to break down about a dozen fights. It was going to be 13, but Said Nurmagomedov and Daniel, I'm already forgetting the name, forgive me. Willie Cat is his nickname. Poor Willie Cat apparently has an injury and is out of that fight. So we've only got a dozen to break down. I've only got about 8 picks that I put out for this card. There's about 4 fights that I'm staying off. So I know I've made a habit of saying, I'm going to try to keep this under 2 hours and then end up going over that for cards with much less. But I am going to try to not espouse very much on the fights that I'm staying away from, of which there are about 4. And I will try to keep this slimmer than I think you would probably expect, given the amount of fights that I'm going to have to talk about here. But should be a very action-packed card. I'm glad that I can sit back and enjoy at least 4 of these. So let's we'll get into it shortly. I do want to talk about UFC Vegas 98 and 99 real fast, because if you've been paying attention, then obviously you know it's been a I'm not quite sure what the correct word for it is. It is devastating, but at the same time, it's like, you know, I've gone 12 for 14 on my last 14 picks the last 2 weeks. So is it really that bad? Yeah, it is when you run the strategy that I do and you come out without any profit from those events, particularly when you're a round away, in both cases, from lucratively profiting on the event. You know, I hate using that word. I think most people probably know why. Just given the space that we're in. But, you know, when you're in a position to turn a massive night into, or when you regularly expose yourself to turning a massive night into a, just another loss, it's pretty devastating when your last leg doesn't hit. And there's, people like to say about parlays, it's always the last leg. But in this case, it was pretty devastating for the reasons that both of the legs were considerably heavy favorites. Obviously, I'm more miffed about Kyler Phillips than Tatsuro Taira. When I put the Taira pick out, he was still minus 225, and he ended up swelling out to minus 300 by fight night. And even after the weigh-ins, when I started putting the parlays out, and I still felt comfortable playing him at that price. I thought he was going to be more resilient about consistently committing to getting takedowns that would have put him in a position to win perhaps some of the earlier rounds. He did unfortunately kind of reflect the trend from the Alex Perez fight, where he didn't really end up shooting in the first round of that fight, and that lack of urgency ended up costing him an early round, at least in the eyes of 2 judges. I was surprised looking back. I thought that the way that the 3rd round was scored, given although Taira took an unbelievable amount of damage on the feet from Royval, to the point that people thought Royval was potentially going to end up finishing the fight, the last minute or so was the closest that Taira himself got to finishing the fight relative to finishing the round with the back and having the rear naked choke attempts on Royval. I thought, okay, are they going to reward Taira for ending the round in his control and nearly finishing the fight himself? or are they going to reward the fact that Royval totally just outlanded him on significant strikes? All three of the judges gave Royval the third round, and even the commentary team at the end of the fight said it probably comes down to how you score round 3. So it was interesting that Sal D'Amato, who did not have a great night, going back to not only that instance, but I think UFC Paris as well, said that he thought Tyra won the first round, which, looking back, the difference in significant striking wasn't that supreme. And Tyra did, he was able to kind of sting him a few times, but it wasn't, he definitely didn't have the optics of volume that Royval did. So I thought that he had a better case for winning the third round than he did the first. So having that kind of a loss on a split decision was pretty devastating. And if you know what my other gig is, then I was working the highest profile college football game that night in congruency with when the Royval-Tyra fight was happening. And so I stayed up until about 3 a.m. that night reporting on the post-game press conferences of the coaches and writing a statistical analysis article about why the team that lost did so, and having to do that in tandem with processing the fact that I had a 92 unit night slip away on a split decision that would have otherwise been a sweep for me. It was pretty devastating. But, tried to keep a clear head about it and say, all right, there's still events left this year. Let's go into the next week, and we'll, we can rebound and recover from this. And then the same thing happens, except with a fighter that closed as a 6-1 favorite. Now, I'm more miffed about this one, obviously, just because this could have been avoidable given how far Kyler Phillips swelled out. He was floating around the 300 range when I was evaluating the fight, and then by the time I was ready to put the pick out later in the week, he had already swollen out to a 4.5-1 favorite. And I just barely felt confident to keep playing him in that range. And looking back, I think that the thing that I didn't give enough credit to was the effectiveness of TriStar Gym, which I actually wasn't really aware until after the weigh-ins already happened, and I'd already put my picks out, which is a mistake on my part, that Rob Font had switched camps from New England. I'm forgetting what the name of the team that he uses out of, I think, Massachusetts area is. He had gone up to Canada, done his work at TriStar, which is the gym of George St. Pierre, and Ayman Zahabi, the head coach of that team, I believe, is Zahabi's brother or father. I'm not sure, one of his family members. But it's generally regarded as a very respected gym. I personally, just because they don't have the wealth of UFC fighters that some other places like American Top Team or American Kickboxing Academy, Extreme Couture, Nova União, even a place like Shootbox, Killcliff FC, I don't know if I personally would have put City Kickboxing, I don't know if I would have put TriStar up in the caliber of those gyms, but I think in wake of this performance, given the fact that they also, I think, played a big part in Zahabi having one of the biggest upsets of the year himself over Yavid Basharat earlier this year, and the fact that you've got GSP still training out of that gym, who I think is pretty unanimously undisputed on the Mount Rushmore of UFC fighters historically, I think I'm probably more willing in the future to be conciliatory towards that gym as having world-class status. So I blame myself for overlooking that. I probably wouldn't have felt good playing Kyler in the 400 range had I looked at more into detail in that. And it's unfortunate because I taped both Not well. I had taped Rob Font pretty well before his fight with Iggy, or Figgy rather, and I actually made Font a parlay leg in that case. So him having such a letdown performance against Figueiredo was another big reason I felt good about playing Phillips here. But it was really me being more confident in what I had seen from Phillips in his most recent outing against Pedro Munoz that made me feel good about playing him last week. I think that of the three big upsets that happened last week, I feel like Phillips, even though he had the most expensive price tag, is probably the one, and maybe this is just me coping, but I feel like that's the one that probably was the least of a disappointment. Just because pretty much everybody that was playing Rebellis to Spain expected a first-round KO and had written off Austin Lane as a joke. And, I mean, I saw pretty clearly based on Lane's last performance, I even though he hasn't gone the distance yet in his career, he's got title fight round experience in fights that he's won. I think that people are just mostly speculating that he doesn't have the gas tank, which is much different than if you've actually seen them gas out multiple times before. There's a couple fighters on this card that we're going to talk about later where I think people are kind of doing that to the detriment of the value of these fighters, which is why I think they're probably not more expensive than they otherwise should be. But Lane proved that he can put together a ground game heavy game plan for at least 2 of the 3 rounds. I think him giving away the second round to Spain was a product of him recognizing that he wanted to have more left to win the fight on his terms in the final round, which is exactly what he did. And he ended up spoiling that pretty well. I think Hadley easily had to be the most underwhelming performance. And it's, him blowing weight against Callan Loughran, even though I had picked him to win at UFC 304. I mean, you saw exactly why I said, you know what, I'm willing to just stay off this fight because I don't really know where this guy is at. He misses weight, moving up a weight class, which is very surprising despite the fact that he took the fight on short notice. But you watch a result like the one that just happened last weekend, and it just leaves you wondering, wow, how good is Callan Loughran really? If Jake Hadley was able to 30-27 him on short notice and, Hadley just had the performance that he had, Hadley's already been removed from the UFC roster for that, which I think is pretty unbelievable. That's a guy that came into the show off of Contender Series as an undefeated UK prospect, and the UFC likes to prop those guys up because the UK market is obviously one that they can build a lot of star power out of. You saw how long they were willing to prop up Leon Edwards. You see the ascension of, I know Aspinall's not undefeated, but you see the ascension of Tom Aspinall's star now that he's been interim champion for a little bit, in spite of the fact that they're still trying to get John Jones through. Mick Parkin is another great example. No, I'm just kidding. But there is a there's an interest in having these lofty record UK fighters for the expressive growing stars out of that market. And there's one of them on this card actually that we're going to get into a little bit later, and why I think that sort of propping up has presented a potential underdog opportunity here. But before I jump into UFC 308, just to kind of put a bow on these recaps, it's like I said, Phillips, it was a letdown performance, but he did win the first round. He had kind of shown, I think, a little bit of the same problem that came up in the Font fight against Rowley and Paiva, where he arguably got a 10-8 round to start the Paiva fight. I'm not saying the first round against Font was a 10-8 because Font was able to get up before the end of the round, but Phillips, a lot of people thought, got a 10-8 against Paiva, and then when Paiva didn't go away, Phillips kind of like faded out, let Paiva come back. A lot of people thought that should have been a draw instead of a majority decision win in favor of Paiva. but I was willing to overlook that just because Phillips was still younger into his career. I thought this guy's younger than Font is. Font's coming off a big letdown performance. He was favored over Figgy, as I alluded to earlier. This Phillips is coming into his prime years and is training out of a really good gym, MMA lab, with the likes of Sean O'Malley and Marcus McGee at his same weight class. This is somebody who I think is, coming into a position where they're going to be able to set them up to be set themselves up to be a contender in this division eventually, and that just didn't end up being the case. I think that he had all the tools to win that fight. He just kind of, the same thing happened with Paiva, which is when Font was pressuring him in a way that he didn't like, he just kind of wilted and let it get away from him. I did think the third round was closer than a lot of other people are saying it was. I looked back at the stats later. I was surprised that the stats said that Font landed 9 more significant strikes, because it felt like, even though Font was having better combinations, it did feel like Phillips was landing a little bit more consistently with his kicks throughout the round. But that didn't end up being the case, and Phillips lost the fight unanimously. So I even said in my own instant analysis after the pick that I'm obviously biased personally in the way that I'm looking at that. So it was a pretty devastating way to follow up losing a sweep on the Tyra result, losing another sweep on back-to-back weeks. It hurts, the Tyra thing was already painful enough where it was like I didn't even really have the energy to do the minute to win it breakdowns last weekend. So my apologies if you missed those for UFC Vegas 99, but it was hard to build up the energy kind of to do it this week again too. But this is the fate I've chosen for myself, at least with the current betting strategy. So two more quick things before we jump into 308, because I don't want this I don't want this intro section to go too long. You might have noticed, if you've seen any of the minute to win it breakdowns that I've recorded during the day, or even the last RAXPOD, the camera that I use, I didn't buy it myself. All of my equipment was purchased for me by someone that wanted, or an employer that wanted me to get into the podcasting space. So that's part of the reason I started the show last year, and I'm very, very prideful of that I'm, I didn't buy my own internet influencer equipment. It was purchased for me because they believe in my talent in the space. I'm being facetious, obviously, but the camera does not like dealing with the daylight background I have in this apartment I'm in now. It wasn't as much of a problem when I was in Miami for reasons that I'm not really sure why. But obviously, you can see for this time, because I'm recording during the day again, I've tried to be more diligent about getting these done at nighttime just because it's easier for the camera to stay in focus. But it was obviously having a problem with that with the window. So if you're not one of the people who kind of like me puts your podcasts on that are on YouTube and just kind of leaves them in the background and doesn't watch, if you're actually watching the screen and the out of focusness was bothering you for not only this but maybe also the minute to win it, because I know the camera I have does some pulsing in and out of focus sometimes, I do apologize for that. That's why I put the background up in this case for this episode, so that the camera wasn't going to be doing that ridiculousness for the duration I'm going to be talking about this. So thank you for bearing with me on that. I thought I was going to get more bad feedback for that, but nobody really pointed it out. But if it did bother you, I just wanted to acknowledge that I've taken countermeasures in order to try to prevent that, and I will try to go for more of a nighttime backdrop going forward. But last thing I just want to bring up in relation to what happened the last 2 weeks. It's pretty devastating what happened in terms of losing out on profit that could have potentially turned around what's otherwise been a down year to this point. The thing about this strategy is I was in a very, very similar position in the middle of June before two very, very successful events ended up putting me in the black for the rest of the year. That's the nature of this strategy. You're going to be down until you're way, way up. And I've seen that happen now over the course of 2 years of doing this. It's just a matter of when do those really great days come. We had one sweep that happened at UFC 298 this year, and I'm hopeful to get at least one more before the end of the year. There were plenty of instances last year, too, where I was one pick off of having really great days. But it feels like this year there have been just way more than there were the last 2 years, instances of where one high-confidence pick has ended up spoiling everything, which is a tough thing to deal with when you're dealing with a parlay-only strategy that tries to only use money lines and hedges on rounds that are available to everybody through the most accessible book in the world. So I am very much playing the game on the hardest difficulty setting possible, trying to prove that something works, that I'm confident works over a long term, but that the general sentiment in the public is that it is not the correct way to go about doing this. So I've taken on all of that. But just to kind of stress how crazy it's been this year in terms of, I don't really want to say bad luck, but just taking tough beats. I just want to recap some of the events that I've had from the beginning of this year, just to give you some perspective. So I've put out, this is going to be the 30th event that I've put out action for. I've put out picks for every event, obviously, this year, but there have been, I believe, about 4 that I've skipped just because I haven't recognized enough value relative to what was on the board. In 14 of the 29 events that I have put out picks for this year, I have been one pick off of profiting on those 14 that I just mentioned. And so I just want to go through that list really quickly. Starting with the very first event of the year, which I would have profited on if Tom Nolan, as a 3-1 favorite, had been able to knock out Nicholas Mata. Instead, he got chinned himself. The hype train on Nolan obviously let a lot of people down throughout different stages of this year, not in his fight after this one, but in this case, coming off of his big Contender Series knockout, it certainly did. So UFC Vegas 84, that was disappointing, but we move on. Next event, UFC 297. I was surprised that Brad Katona didn't get a unanimous or at least a split decision over Garrett Armfield, given he was fighting in Canada. The crowd didn't like that decision either. It was a bad night for Canadian MMA, but that's 2 events where it could have been a little bit different. I'm not counting this one in terms of what we just said, but I did. There was a no contest in the Kizriev fight at UFC Vegas 85 that had he been able to win that, I would have had a profitable night instead of a push, even though I did have a parlay cash in that one. So kind of a bad break there too. The event after UFC 298, which I did kind of a victory lap RAXPOD for, UFC Mexico, I would have had a 41 unit profiting night if Yair had been able to finish the job that he started after getting a 10-8 over Brian Ortega in the first round after Ortega rolled his ankle. That was one of the worst letdown performances of the year. Had I merely chosen to go with the over on rounds in the main event as the more confident parlay leg than the Rodriguez money line, would have gotten profit on that event too. But it is what it is. After that, UFC 299 would have profited if Almeida hadn't gotten stuck on the fence with the hammer fists with Curtis Blades. Had some bad reads on a lot of the events after that. After that. UFC 300 barely missed out on profit because the under on the Bo Nickel Cody Brundage fight didn't hit. UFC 301 we profited. UFC 302 I would have had a 45 unit winning night if Alex Morono, but I had too much confidence in Alex Morono, which strongly fueled my desire to fade him against Daniel Rodriguez a couple weeks ago. So that was an 8 out of 10 night for me. The only other fight I missed was the main event, in which I kind of was forced to hedge on rounds because I didn't want to bet Makhachev at like 500 or whatever against Dustin Poirier. UFC Louisville, I think I had 2 different picks that ended up missing profit on that, not just one, so we won't count that one. UFC Saudi Arabia, the under not hitting in the Pavlovich-Volkov fight ended up costing me profit there. UFC 303 we profited on, which was good. I was only 1 pick off of a sweep in that case, even though I made 42 units on that event. That was the Ricky Simone fight against Vinicius Oliveira. UFC Denver, the following event, Josh Van getting KO'd cost me 70 units on what would have been 5 different parlay hits. UFC 304 obviously could have been my most unbelievably profitable event ever. I did end up making profit on it, but I only went 10 for 11 on my picks because I took the over in the King Green Patty Pimblett fight. But won't count that one because, again, I made profit on that event still. UFC 305, another Tom Nolan bad beat. The Nolan Reyes fight went to decision. Fight goes the distance, and that fight was like plus 1,100. The under was a minus 350. Everybody thought Nolan was going to nuke a guy in Reyes who really wasn't cut out for the UFC, but Reyes was able to kind of stall the fight out a little bit, even though he really didn't have that much success in that fight. UFC Vegas 96, I would have had a 33.5 unit night of profit, but as I talked about on another pre-show recap, the spinning elbow out of the clinch that Michael Morales landed on Neil Magny cost me my over in that one. So, of course, in this era where everybody complains about the gloves leading to the lack of knockouts, one of the overs that I make as a parlay leg on one of the guys that's traditionally one of the most reliable fighters at dragging fights out to a decision isn't able to do it in that circumstance, although it obviously had nothing to do with the gloves. UFC 306 had a pretty good night other than the main event. Sean O'Malley not starting with a greater sense of urgency ended up costing him his belt and me profit on that one. UFC Paris, I've already spoken about the Gomes robbery at length on the last show, so that ended up costing me profit at that event too. UFC 307 did have a slight profit, as you can see on the screen above. Just a little bit of 3U. Would have been a much better night had the Almeida Potiera under hit in that circumstance, but Almeida was not able to knock out Ihor in that case, and I didn't really scrutinize Almeida's knockout power enough in that circumstance. As I talked about on the breakdown of that pick I gave about needing to do that, and I'm going to talk about a little bit later for, I think, a couple different people on this card relative to just, needing to scrutinize that one punch lights out ability a little bit. And then obviously the last 2 events, a 300 favorite not getting the job done, and a favorite that closed at minus 675 not getting the job done, ends up costing me a total of 164 units, despite going 12 for 14 on picks. This is the fate I chose for myself. So we've got a handful of events left for this year, going into the end of October right now, and then we'll have a nice little slate for November, and then a couple more in December. Pay-per-views, we're still going to end the year way, way up. Made 81 units on these this year, and there's 3 left. So even if I go broke on the next 3 events, we will still end the year up at least 51 units on pay-per-views, which I think is pretty good. And we're up 107 units on pay-per-view since UFC 290 last year. So all things considered, the shows where we're working with fighters that have much more robust sample size than these a lot of these lower level Apex events have been pretty good. So I still put it on myself for the fight selection that I choose, but I think that if you've followed long enough at this point, you recognize that most of these picks are pretty solid, and there are some bumps in the road, but the days when I'm on pretty good. I have my off days just like anybody else, but long term, these are pretty reliable reads, particularly in the department of underdogs, where we've had a really good second half of 2024 so far, and would like to keep it going heading into this card. I have at least one underdog I'm very confident in. The other one, it's going to be a little bit more of a challenge, especially because the numbers aren't necessarily totally in favor of the guy that I'm thinking might be able to have a great showing here, but we'll get into that later in the show. So that's about a half hour of me rambling on the recent events of what have happened. So thank you for sticking around for this long. Time to get into the actual fights at UFC 308, and we will start with Ismail Nardiev and Brunno Silva. The next fight is Farid Basharat and Victor Hugo. Basharat enters 12-0. Last appeared at January at the start of this year, the very first event for the UFC, Ankalaev Walker 2. Got a unanimous decision over Taylor Lapilus. Conversely, Victor Hugo has only fought once since his Contender Series appearance last season. Or is it last season now? Now that Contender Series is technically over. The Contender Series of 2023, Season 7. Either way, fought Pedro Falcao earlier this year. I took Falcao as a speculative underdog, and that fight was, I think it ended up being like a 29-28, but Hugo won 2 rounds pretty clearly, if memory serves correct. That was in April at Fight Night, Allen versus Curtis 2. The Basharat brothers have both kind of proven to be decision machines. Yavid more so than Farid, but even then, Farid's only got one UFC finish during his run. I think that's still more than his brother Yavid had. And obviously, Yavid had that big letdown performance I alluded to earlier during the preview when Ayman Zahavi beat him earlier this year as like a plus 500 underdog or something. So Farid presumably has a little bit better momentum than his brother now at this stage, if for no other reason than he's still undefeated. The line clearly expects Farid to just run over Silva here. He's a minus 650 favorite. I think that's pretty significantly overvalued, just given we haven't seen a lot out of Hugo yet, although I do understand that, Hugo is a guy who, so much of his submission success has been heel hook based, and being a fighter that chases those at this level of MMA is usually not very conducive to consistent success. Claudio Puelles is a pretty clear example of that. So I think most people are probably expecting Basharat by unanimous decision here. So I don't have much to say about this one specifically as a fight, just because I do think that Basharat is probably going to get the better of the striking, but not really make a big impression on damage. And Hugo will probably end up going for, as he recognizes he's losing the fight on the feet, will probably start trying to shoot for the submissions that he's comfortable with that are going to give up dominant position and put Basharat in a situation where he's able to control the fight on the ground on his own terms and, work himself out of the leg locks and not really be in any realistic danger. So I think that's a pretty easy read there. What I want to talk about really quick before I move on is just, the read that I gave out earlier this week. I don't log in to the book to actually bet until after the weigh-ins are over. I don't need to. I used to before I started using fight odds reliably, previously I'd been using the website Best Fight Odds, which is what a lot of cappers were doing before Fight Odds IO came out. And Fight Odds IO was comprehensive and automatically updating and reliable enough and sorted by different major books that most cappers, most people in general are pretty comfortable quoting from that book. Now, because from that website when they're putting out prices or just trying to track the movement on different lines. Now, because it is an automated system, I'm presuming, when a line goes up, they'll automatically grab it and display it on the site. And I think that's what happened in the case of BetOnline and Bovada, originally lining this fight in terms of the hedge on rounds at +1.5. So because I recognized that I was going to be needing to put out probably about 3 or 4 picks a day in order to get all of them out before trying to get the RAXPOD up on Wednesday night, I said, okay, I'm going to have to put out about 3 picks on Sunday. I usually don't start putting them out until Monday if I want to get all of them out accordingly before the show comes out. So in that case, because this was one of the first 3 fights that I had 2 competitors for that I could evaluate with previous UFC sample, I said, okay, I'm looking at this, and this, it looks like they line this for 1.5. We'll see if that changes as the week goes on. I'm a little bit surprised, but yeah, I think that that's good value. I'm not surprised that they're expecting the fight to go over. That's what I expect too. I am a little surprised it's not lined at 2.5 rounds. I see some other books have it lined at 2.5 rounds, but I feel pretty good about this fight going over the midway point. So I'm glad that they put it out there. There have been cases where fights have been lined at 1.5 or 2.5 and then either lined down to 1.5 or lined up to 2.5 during the week. They haven't happened often this year. I don't think it's actually happened this year for any of the hedges on rounds I've done, but over the previous 2 years I've seen it happen before, and I've had to clarify on Twitter that this is no longer available, but it doesn't usually happen on the same day where they realize their mistake. So in this case, I put the pick out on Sunday for 1.5, which was the same day that the line came out, and they BetOnline evidently removed the 1.5 and relined it for 2.5 with more juice because they recognized we're probably going to get steamed on this because most people aren't going to want to play Basharat money line at 600 to begin with. So that was no longer available. So I'm probably not going to end up playing this fight to begin with. It'll just be a stay away because Basharat's got obviously too much juice on him at this point, even though I do expect him to win. But because that pick was no longer available, you had some people like this French fry bets. Great branding choice, by the way. French fries bets, telling me that you're, good sir, I'm looking to tail, but I don't see that line on a site that has props. And then trying to go further than that and, say, are you actually betting the bets you offer on here? Absolutely ridiculous. You don't even play the bets that you tip. You offer picks not widely available on lines that don't exist. Fuck off. I'm sorry, but if I had something to hide at this point, do you really think that I would have made it as far as I have, particularly as somebody that doesn't have a BetMMA.tips? I do the third-party tracking on Twitter myself. I put every single recap for the week pinned up on the site for what picks did and didn't hit. I'm very transparent with my losses. I'm very transparent about how much is being staked, and every week is the same case where the picks go out during the week. The prices are what they are when the picks go out. The value either goes up or it goes down. Sometimes they're CLV, sometimes it's the reverse. because I'm of the mind that you shouldn't be locking in your bets until you're confident that not only the fighter that you're betting on makes weight, but that both fighters make weight, so that if you're doing parlay betting or you're a results-focused bettor, one of your legs in the parlay doesn't kick because the fight ends up getting canceled because one guy blew weight and either didn't get medical clearance or the other guy opted to not fight after his opponent didn't make it due to a lack of professionalism or whatever else. So there's nothing wrong with waiting until the weigh-ins. I always tip the picks early because, number one, all of the advice is free for the benefit of the community. And to that point, you get the picks out early. The other people can play them as straights or whatever else they want to do at an earlier stage than I do it. I am making the work that I do available early to other people so that they can profit on it, potentially at an earlier date with more value if they so choose. And I go about my business in the way that I handle it to the cost of nobody. So if you got a problem with that, go fuck yourself. Don't cost you anything. There's no scam involved here. I'm not asking anybody for any handouts or anything else. So the fact that I still have to deal with shit like that after an instance like this, where I'm just quoting a price from, that was the most ridiculous thing, saying that you're tipping lines and prices not widely available. Every single price is quoted from the most accessible book in the entire world. That's why I do it from Bet Online, because anybody anywhere can access that. Not using DraftKings prices and single game parlays the way that so many other people do, because FanDuel and DraftKings are only available in select states in the US. I'm making stuff and plays that are accessible to anywhere worldwide. That's my policy with doing this. I'm going to get beat on value in a lot of cases with that, but because I'm results focused, I don't let that component of it bother me. I just look at it from a results perspective, and because I'm doing that, I try to make these the most accessible they can be. So, not widely available, frankly, you don't know what you're talking about. Maybe that Canadian, that Canuck is just salty because Katona lost last weekend, and frankly, right now, Canada has no hopes for any good mixed martial arts future. So, that's just me. At least you guys will always have GSP, but don't take it out on me. And again, this is just pretty clearly an instance in which Fight Odds picked up a line that Bet Online and Bovada, so two different books, not just one, recognized. You know what? We're probably going to get cooked on one side betting over here, so we should probably reline this and pull it down. Fight Odds just pulled that up. I put the pick out the same day. Got pulled down. It is what it is. So I do think this one goes over and goes the distance, but it is a little bit too juiced for my liking. Basharat himself obviously is too juiced to play here, so I wouldn't bet this, but go figure. Basharat by decision is what everybody's expecting, so no surprises here. And if you're going to come correct, you best not miss. The next fight is Kennedy Nzechukwu and Chris Barnett. Nzechukwu enters 12-5, suffered one of the betting upsets of the year, losing a split decision to Ovin St. Preux back at Fight Night Tuivasa Tybura. That was one of the events that I skipped betting this year. I did take it's funny. I talk about usually when you're expecting the underdog to win, just not hedging on rounds, but that was a rare instance where I thought the fight was going to go over, and the over was available at plus odds. So I said, okay, OSP is old, and even though I think that he's got a reasonable chance to win this, I'm just going to take what I think is the safer plus odds play here and put the pick out for the over. And that ended up hitting. Both of them ended up hitting. OSP ended up winning by split. It was a big letdown performance from Kennedy and Nzechukwu, who had been coming off a knockout loss to Justin Jacoby at UFC 288 when he fought Devin Clark. I made him a parlay leg. He was favored over Clark, and he ended up getting the first submission win of his MMA career in that case. Conversely, Chris Barnett was supposed to fight, I believe it was, if it wasn't last week, it was 2 weeks ago. It was at one of the last Apex events. But he had to pull out due to the event surrounding hurricane, one of the hurricanes in Florida. The one that hit Tampa, not the one that hit the Panhandle pretty hard. And I do want to clarify, just because, he hasn't fought since September 2022 against Jake Collier at UFC 279. I did take Collier as a pretty heavy favorite in that fight. That fight probably should have been stopped because Barnett was suffering what looked like to be a stroke after the first round, and it was rather surprising that the fight didn't get stopped. I think if the doctor that stopped the Benoit Saint Denis Renato Moicano fight about a month ago had been working that event, they probably wouldn't have let Barnett go back out there. But credit to him, he did end up getting a big comeback because Collier gassed. I don't expect the same thing to happen in this case. What I will say is, there were a lot of people that were giving Barnett shit for the way that he pulled out of his most recent fight, and I actually wasn't even aware of looking into it. I wasn't even aware of the personal tragedy that guy has suffered, despite the fact that I was capping his fights both against Martin Buday and Jake Collier in 2022. 2 weeks after he lost to Martin Buday, Chris Barnett's wife died of what I believe was something related to a brain injury. And he had, I believe, 2 children with her. So, I don't know what his current relationship status is, but the guy lost the mother of his children and is raising his children without their mother in Florida. And you can imagine that having that stress only 2 years removed from that setback, while there's a hurricane going on that's potentially going to destroy your house, it kind of makes sense that the guy's only fought once since that happened. And it makes you feel really good that, he was able to get the win over Collier in the fashion that he did in that sense. But it makes sense why the guy hasn't competed in almost 2 years at this point, given that he's been having to juggle all of that. But he's 38 now. He's one of the only heavyweights that's ever missed the heavyweight limit, which happened in his fight against Collier. And so earlier this week, when the fight, Nzechukwu had opened as a 700 favorite. And earlier in the week, he had gotten down to like minus 550 at that point. And I thought, yeah, that's probably a good place for betting Barnett at this point, because outside of Barnett's experience going the distance, there's fight IQ concerns with Kennedy here, but Kennedy also has clearly been facing a much higher level of competition, not only recently, but just throughout his UFC career, in which he's got far more experience than Barnett at this point, than what Barnett has had. The best opponent that Barnett has fought was Ben Rothwell, probably the biggest opponent Barnett has fought too, other than Buday. And in the case where he fought both of those guys that were, such imposing, larger physical and in better shape fighters than him, he got blown out in both cases. Now, this is Nzechukwu's UFC heavyweight debut. It remains to be seen how much weight that he's actually put on for this fight, and I think what kind of shape he's going to be in. But the guy was already one of the biggest light heavyweights and certainly had the frame that would support moving up. He's going to be 8 inches taller than Barnett here, which I think is going to be among the largest discrepancies in terms of height that we've seen in a UFC fight recently. He's going to have 8 inches of reach on the guy too, which only emphasizes that. And Nzechukwu was a southpaw facing an orthodox fighter in Barnett, so that was already going to give Barnett some problems in the striking. And unless Nzechukwu just totally mentally checks out of this fight after the first round, which I don't really expect happening, I don't see a situation in which Nzechukwu gasses out and Barnett is able to kind of take advantage of a sloppy takedown attempt that lets him get top position in the way that led to his comeback against Collier. I think Nzechukwu is going to be able to stay measured and avoid really taking any compromising damage here, especially because of how wild Barnett is with his own striking attempts. Even if this ends up going the distance, I think Nzechukwu at worst is going to end up getting some kind of 29-28. I would expect something closer to like a 30-27, but I also, just given the fact that Barnett is coming off of such a massive layoff and has been finished, knocked out even in the first round of fights before, and has just such a physical disadvantage here, I think that it would be very, very surprising if Nzechukwu doesn't end up finding some finish within the first 10 minutes. So I'm going to say Nzechukwu puts it on Barnett pretty bad. Not necessarily from the jump, but Barnett kind of tries to throw everything that he can at Nzechukwu within the first 2.5 minutes and is already getting tired. And Nzechukwu is just kind of able to pick him apart from there and get a first-round KO in the final minute of the first round. So that's really all I have to say about this one. It would be great to see Huggy Bear, Beast Boy, whatever you call him, get one win and go off into the sunset. But, I mean, realistically speaking, this guy is just not at the stage anymore where he's going to be able to compete with the kind of physical presence that Nzechukwu presents based on what his previous experience in the UFC has been. I don't like that Nzechukwu's back out to 750. I mean, that's just, unless I need like one leg to like get myself over the line from like, a 4-unit return being 9 units that would otherwise be 10 units if I tag this on. I don't really want to have to do that. But also the difference in implied odds between like 500 and 700 range is only like a handful of percentage points. So it's, I have Nzechukwu graded to where I feel good about betting him in that 500 range. I don't really want to do it any further than that. But I already put the pick out. I still feel good about him doing this. It would be nice to see Barnett get a win. A big reason I bought a ticket to UFC 287 was because I thought that he actually had a pretty good chance to beat Chase Sherman. And I was pretty devastated that I think Barnett was the one that pulled out of that fight and I didn't get to see him. But thankfully, 287 had one of the best moments in MMA history, at least certainly the best post-fight celebration with Izzy Pereira. So I'm glad I got to see that in person at least. But I really wanted to see Barnett in person, and I didn't get to, and that was disappointing. So I hope he has a good showing here, but I just don't expect it given the matchup. I think that this is Kennedy's fight to lose. He's got plenty of different ways to win it, and I expect him to win by first-round knockout. The next fight is Abus Magomedov and Brunno Ferreira. Magomedov enters 26-6-1. Last fought once earlier this year at Fight Night Barboza Murphy against Warlley Alves, in which he won a pretty clear-cut unanimous decision, picking up at least one 10-8 round along the way, I believe, in the second round of that fight. Prior to that, had lost a unanimous decision to Caio Baralho at Fight Night Almeida Lewis in Brazil, and was the final loss on a fight I picked him to lose against Sean Strickland at what was my second sweep of last year. The most profitable event I had of last year, Fight Night Strickland Magomedov. I made Strickland a parlay leg for that fight, and a Strickland, after letting Magomedov kind of throw everything out at him in the first round, Strickland was able to parry pretty much. I don't know if parry's the right word, but he defended everything without really taking any significant damage. The worst thing that happened to Strickland in that first round was getting poked in the eye early on. And then after letting Magomedov tire himself out because it was a 5-round fight, Strickland put it on him the rest of the way and was able to get a knockout in the final minute of the second round. Conversely, Ferreira is 4-1 in the UFC. His only loss last year was to Nursultan Ruziboyev in what was a perfect example of why I never, ever, ever pick fights that feature UFC debutants that haven't at least fought on Contender Series, because you just don't know what's going to happen with these guys that are coming out of nowhere to potentially, upset somebody that's available at an otherwise significantly juiced price. I believe Ferreira was either a 3 or a 4-1 favorite when he fought Ruzaboyev. Looking at it now, so the line slimmed a little bit more. So he closed at like minus 230. So it wasn't quite 3-1, 4-1. I remember it, but I remember him earlier in that week being more of a he was available at loftier prices than that. But that was also at Fight Night Strickland Magomedov. So that was on top of watching my clean sweep materialize that night, it was good to watch that result and think this is exactly why you don't bet fights that feature debutants. But otherwise, I've had some interesting history with Brunno Ferreira fights. When he fought Gregory Robocop Rodriguez, it's one of my favorite hedges on rounds of my betting career to that point, because I did really like Robocop, but thought he was a little bit overvalued just given he had been knocked out before, and Ferreira clearly had that kind of nuclear power. I sound like George Bush. Nuclear power, and he ended up getting the knockout in the first round of that one. And, in terms of me talking about when you're trying to evaluate the one-punch lights-out ability of fighters and really having to scrutinize it, it's so nice when fighters just leave no doubt for you, particularly when they just get to the UFC and you see it. That knockout that Ferreira had on Rodriguez was, it always blows my mind when I know what the result is going to be of a fight, particularly when it's a fight I've watched before, and then I go back and I watch it on tape again, and it still elicits a reaction out of me that's just like, "Buh, holy shit." And that's exactly what happened when I rewatched Rodriguez Ferreira. I'd watched Ferreira just kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a feint. It might have been more of a whiff than a feint, but he kind of, gave a little bit of a half-hearted, show of the hook, and then really came in with the 1-2. And on the second strike that he landed from that, just caught Rodriguez perfectly onto the end of the chin, and the guy was gone. It was a hell of a knockout. And then he knocked out Phil Hawes, who had kind of had a rep for being chinny already to that point. And then his fight with Dustin Stoltzfus, which was his last appearance at Fight Night Cannonier Imavov. I believe I advocated for that being a stay away. I think I had Ferreira graded slightly to win, but he was I think he was a pretty hefty favorite over Stoltzfus, if memory serves. He was a minus 270 favorite. I thought that was a little bit overvalued just because Stoltzfus had better experience going the distance. And Stoltzfus, I think, gave a pretty good account for himself. Might have even been winning that fight on volume to that point until Ferreira turned the fight totally around with one massive spinning elbow, and then I think might have gotten a little bit of grace on. I don't necessarily want to say it was an early stoppage because he probably would have. He had Stoltzfus wobbled pretty badly by the time he landed the second one, and it's not like Stoltzfus went out. He kind of just dropped to a knee on the second one, and then Herzog waved the fight off. Certainly wasn't the worst early stoppage that Jason Herzog had that night, but it was still a. It was a good win for Ferreira. I would say that he probably performed a price, but it didn't quell the concerns that people have about his cardio that I think are kind of making him an underdog here against Magomedov. Now, this is one of the two fights that I did the most tape work for this week because I generally think if you have an opportunity to go back and watch like all of the fights for a UFC career of one guy, because none of the fights are going to decision, you should probably do it. So I felt good about doing that for Ferreira. I even watched his Contender Series appearance, and I did the same thing for Magomedov. I watched all of his UFC fights because his first fight with Stoltzfus lasted less than 20 seconds. I hadn't actually watched his fight with Strickland since the night that it happened, so it was great for me to go down memory lane after such a nice result for me that night overall and be able to relive that. Then I rewatched the Caio Borralho fight. I had made Borralho a parlay leg for that fight night Almeida Lewis last year, and then I picked Warlley Alves as an underdog, which, even though I think Alves made Magomedov, like, I don't want to say intimidated, but at least presented enough of a threat that Magomedov recognized that the easiest path to win was going to be for him to take that fight to the ground and control it from there, which we hadn't really seen him do in any of his other UFC appearances to that point. It was a really good showing for Magomedov in a lot of ways. But this is still a guy in a boost that, even though he's got a lot more overall MMA experience than Ferreira does, particularly going the distance, with that comes more attrition. And this is a guy that, when he was fighting for the PFL championship 6 years ago, got knocked out in the first minute of his fight with Lewis Taylor, and had previously suffered, or not previously, that was only the first knockout loss of his career, but I mean, it's hard to trust a guy's chin when they've shown they can be knocked out in the first minute of a fight, which you could say the same thing about Ferreira. But the thing is, Magomedov hasn't shown anywhere close to the amount of power that Ferreira has, just in terms of the punching. What Ferreira has shown, it encouraged me in the Stoltzfus fight, that he hadn't really showcased in his earlier UFC appearances, was, he had kind of really only been someone that was landing 1-2s. His sophistication of combos hadn't really been that good. Both of these guys have really excellent footwork, but even though Ferreira had the great power, he hadn't really shown the ability to land consecutively beyond 1-2 punch combos that I think he did a much better job with in the Stoltzfus fight, even though the two standout strikes from that fight were obviously the spinning back elbows that he had, which are, regardless of whether they're out of a cage clinch or not, really are more kind of meme strikes that you can't necessarily bank on a fighter replicating. So Magomedov, I think, has the more well-rounded skill set, definitely has the better experience going the distance, but we've seen this guy have his own cardio concerns in a way that I don't think you can necessarily pin cardio concerns all the way on Ferreira, because it's really more of a speculative thing. We haven't seen that guy forced to fight into the second half of any fight in his MMA career yet. And even though he has the kind of frame and muscle that just kind of speculatively you would assume that guy's cardio isn't going to be able to hold up, we've seen Magomedov have cardio problems in his fights with Strickland and his fight with Borralho, two fights in which he won the first round, but ended up losing the subsequent rounds, getting finished in one of those cases. So this is really a guy who needs to have his most success early if he wants to win. And he's facing a guy in Ferreira who wins pretty much all of his fights in the first round throughout his run in his MMA career. Ferreira also was a national Brazilian judo champion, so I do think that he's going to have a bit more of a sophisticated, if not ground game, than just like kind of ability to get up, avoid getting taken down, or get kind of like, if Magomedov's trying to get like clinch or trip takedowns, Ferreira's going to kind of be able to more easily turn the tables on him than I think people are expecting if Magomedov does try to go that route. And I don't like what that has potentially on the effect for his gas tank. I think Magomedov, his most effective path to victory here is going to be making the most of the fact that he's going to be the taller fighter by 4 inches. He's going to have a 6-inch, very statistically significant reach advantage here. And given that he has the more well-rounded striking skill set and MMA skill set in general, he just needs to keep this fight at kicking range and kind of skirt the cage. They're in a pay-per-view, so it's going to be a bigger cage than the Apex would allow. He needs to stay out of the preferred punching range of Ferreira and just kind of outpoint with kicks, maybe go for some like teep kicks or kicks to the body to kind of try to wear on that gas tank of Ferreira a little bit. and just try to do the best he can to win the first 2 rounds of this fight and win a fight that goes the distance, as opposed to trying to wrestle against a guy with the kind of judo background that Ferreira has, and potentially, gas himself out earlier, to the point where Ferreira, whose cardio is more of an unknown than a minus, if he still has the power left in the second or third rounds to find Magomedov's chin, then I think that there's the good potential for that. I think given the attrition that Magomedov has anyway, I think Ferreira is going to find his knockout here. This guy's punch power is absolutely devastating, and frankly, I think he has the more impressive win already in his UFC run, being that over RoboCop Rodriguez, than the 2 that Magomedov has over Stoltzfus or Alves, the former of which Ferreira already has an impressive win over in his own right, albeit not as fast. So I think that Ferreira is going to get a first-round knockout here. I wouldn't be surprised if Magomedov kind of shows what he did against Strickland and against Baralho, where he's able to win the first round just kind of on a more volume of strikes and is able to keep the range. But I think Ferreira is going to have enough left where he comes out guns blazing in the second round. Magomedov is already a little bit drained given the output that he puts out in the first round, and isn't able to really, he's going to suffer some kind of strike at one point that just kind of makes him take a deep breath, as he kind of did against Strickland and as he did against Baralho in the third round. There was one strike where he was just kind of like, oh, okay, I really didn't like that one, and was kind of already looking away and whatever and taking himself out of it. He did kind of the same thing at the end of the second round against Strickland too. So I'm going to say that Ferreira gets a first-round knockout. It could come in the second round, but if he's not able to knock out Magomedov, I think Magomedov more realistically probably gets a decision here win than finishes Ferreira himself. A knockout win for Magomedov here, I think, would do a pretty significant lift to his stock in the UFC overall, but I like Ferreira's power enough here, given the attrition of Magomedov, that I'm going to be taking him pretty confidently as an underdog. The next fight is Myktybek, Orolbai, and Mateusz Rębecki. Orolbai enters 13-1-1, last fought at UFC 301, getting a unanimous decision win over Elves Brenner that very nearly could have been a draw, but Brenner suffered a knockdown within the last 5 or 10 seconds of the fight that ended up swinging the final round in Orolbai's favor after getting a point deducted for a fence grab that could have otherwise made the final round a 10-8 in favor of Brenner. That would have led to a draw after Orolbai got 2 10-9 rounds to open the fight. Although, and I picked Brenner to win that fight, so when the knockdown happened, I was like, oh, that kind of sucks, because I thought it could have been a draw. Watching that fight back again in preparation for this, I think actually Orolbai probably did a little bit more damage on the feet, even though Brenner seemed to have a bit better volume and was getting reversals. It would have been close, but Orolbai getting that knockdown, definitely gave him the round. Had that knockdown not happened, it's possible he still would have ended up getting the round anyway. And the point deduction obviously was very ticky-tacky given, how many guys have we seen commit blatant fence grabs this year that haven't actually gotten penalized for it? So it was, I'm sure Orolbai bettors were pissed about that. But, it is what it is. Conversely, Rębecki had one of the biggest letdown performances as like a minus 400 favorite against Diego Ferreira at UFC Fight Night, Luis Nascimento in St. Louis earlier this year. That fight was officiated by, oh God, what's his name? The guy that looks like Oompa Loompa Lesnar. Not Gary Coleman, Gary Copeland. Oh my God, that guy just drives me crazy. The way that he kind of like coils himself when he's getting ready to make a stoppage or whatever. Obviously, he had that ridiculous stoppage at, I believe it was UFC Atlantic City, when Kyle Nelson fought Bill Algeo. Yeah, I hope that guy is nowhere near this event. But yeah, always interesting when Gary Copeland's in the cage. But I was kind of disappointed he didn't let Rębecki kind of stay in there for 9 more seconds and survive going the distance in a fight he was going to end up losing anyway. It's unfortunate that they ended up giving him the knockout loss for that reason. I don't know if Ferreira ended up getting a performance bonus for that, but it's hard to say that he didn't deserve it given the betting market by and large wasn't big in on Rębecki. But Rębecki was a guy that I really liked prior to that performance. But as I dove into his record a little bit more in advance of this one, I can understand, kind of see better why the Ferreira result came to the fruition that it did. So I don't think it really has to deal with the fact that I don't want to call him undersized for lightweight. He's obviously very well built. He's one of these guys that just because of what his reach is at only 66 inches, he's probably somebody that's used to fighting with a reach disadvantage given the weight class he's in nearly every matchup that he's dealing with. So I don't weigh that too much against him in terms of why he lost the Ferreira fight. The thing that I thought was more interesting is that this fight is the first time in Rębecki's MMA career, which goes back to, almost a decade at this point. This fight is the first time that Rębecki's ever been an underdog, and he's got 21 appearances to his name at this point. And granted, he hasn't had betting odds available for all of his MMA appearances, but if you go back and run through when he was the first fight that he apparently had betting odds available for was it was in August of 2017 in a fight that he won by a third round armbar in the last second of the third round. He was a minus 450 favorite. 2 fights later, he was a minus 200 favorite in a fight that he won by TKO in the third round. The fight following that, when he was a main event headliner, there weren't actually odds available for that one, but the fight after that one, he was a minus 770 favorite, and he was also a minus 770 favorite at the fight after that as well. He was a minus 400 favorite in his last fight before his Contender Series appearance. On Contender Series, he was a minus 240 favorite against Nick Fiore in his UFC debut. He was a minus 840 favorite against Loik Radzhabov. I thought there was pretty good value there, especially given Radzhabov ended up missing weight. He was a minus 125 favorite. That was for Fight Night Ilia Topuria. At UFC 295 against Roosevelt Roberts, he was a minus 800 favorite. And then against Carlos Diego Ferreira, he was a minus 410 favorite. So this is a guy that has been at least a 2-1 favorite in almost every fight that he's had in his MMA career. The only exception was the fight with Loik Radzhabov, and that was a fight that Radzhabov blew weight for and did not really handle the damage to the leg kicks well, and ended up kind of wilting in the second round in a fight that Radzhabov was really never able to make competitive. So you have to imagine that the fight against Ferreira was really the first time that Rębecki had ever, I don't want to go as far as to say lost a round, but he clearly wilted after getting a knockdown in the first round and allowed Ferreira to come back in that fight. But even in the first round, I think he still ended up losing on significant strikes to Ferreira. But he was doing more damage to Ferreira in the first round, even though he didn't quite have the volume edge in terms of significant strikes. And then the knockdown just kind of firmly cemented that he won that first round. But then Ferreira clearly, nearly got him finished at the end of the second round. And then by that point, Ferreira had all the momentum. Rębecki was going to need to dig in to win and had already been kind of swelling up under both eyes, and just had nothing going for him in the final round, to where Ferreira was able to get the finish within the final 10 seconds with some help from the coiling Gary Copeland. So you really have to wonder, and again, this is This is some guy that's good at predicting fights, speculating on the actual athletic ability of somebody that is actually doing the fighting. So I don't like to, I'm not one of these people that likes to call guys, flops or busts or a fraud. But just given the history of where you've seen the market liking Rębecki relative to what happened in his last fight, you have to wonder what this guy... I've spoken about before how I don't like using these kind of colloquialisms that a lot of cappers do in terms of having that dog in them, just as an example. But one analogy that I heard very early on when I started doing this that I like, because there's not really a more technical way, I think, to put it into terms, is that some guys fight very well when they're the hammer, but when they have to be the nail, things don't really go as well for them. And I think that's kind of a perfect case of what this is here. We haven't really seen... That was the first time we had to see Rębecki be a nail, and I think that he felt that for the first time in his entire MMA career. And feeling that for the first time when you're, in the prime years of your career and you're already 21 fights in, you're already in the UFC, that's not the best time to have to deal with that kind of adversity. And he really did not respond to it well. And now he's facing a guy that is has blossomed out to a 3-1 favorite to beat him, and a guy in Orolbai who, part of the reason that I faded him against Brenner was because he wasn't even able to land one significant strike per minute when he fought Uros Medic on short notice and got the upset. But I mean, he still carried himself well in the Medic upset, but we saw him fight much more effectively on the feet against Brenner for the first 10 minutes than we did in the appearance against Medic. And then, we got to the third round. Brenner didn't go away. Brenner starts getting reversals, starts having his own amount of striking success in an environment where both guys are tired and they're fighting in Brazil. So it's, hot in that arena, and Orolbai going the distance, having wrestled so much in the first 10 minutes, despite the striking success he had on the feet, was probably tired himself, even though his expression didn't really reflect it as much. His body language, I think, more was communicating that. But even after all that, Orolbai was still able to battle back and get a knockdown in the final 10 seconds of the fight. So we've seen Orolbai, when he's kind of had his opponent giving him back to him, still able to grind back and give it back more in a way that we haven't really seen from Rębecki. So if Rębecki isn't able to come out and spark this guy who's never been finished, who has a very, very effective, strong wrestling game that he's been able to implement up a weight class against much bigger fighters, you have to wonder, I think, what Rębecki's ability to kind of battle himself back into this fight is going to be. I just think Orolbai is going to really put too much pressure on Rębecki early enough to where Rębecki is going to be able to battle himself back in. I don't know if he's going to submit Rębecki because Rębecki's never tapped, but I do expect Orolbai to control this fight pretty effectively, and I do think he's going to end up getting a 30-27 decision. It's possible Rębecki has a similar appearance to last time where he is landing the more effective shots in the first round, and Orolbai's just a little bit too committed to the wrestling where he doesn't do enough striking to begin. But as the fight continues to wear on, Orolbai is able to more effectively implement his game plan, and I think at the worst gets a 29-28 where he has to come back from losing the first round. But I just expect this guy, given the fact that he's going to have a 9.5-inch reach advantage, he's going to be the bigger guy. He's beaten and physically dominated guys in larger weight classes than Rębecki on shorter notice than he's had to prepare for this fight. Both guys have pretty equal punching power, so I think Orolbai is probably going to elect to fight the safer game plan. And Rębecki's takedown defense at 33% is not very good, so I would think that Orolbai is probably going to try to exploit that as much as he can. I think he does that very early on. I think this fight, it's possible Orolbai racks up over 10 minutes of control time, and I think that he gets a pretty clear 30-27 unanimous decision. The next fight is Geoff Neal and Rafael dos Anjos. Geoff Neal enters 15-6, having lost a split decision to Ian Machado Gary at UFC 298 earlier this year that really wasn't that close. I do think that Neal probably, if you wanted to give him any of the rounds, because that was one of those weird fights where two judges score at 30-27 for the winner and one dissenting judge gives a 29-28 to the other side. I do think Neal, if you want to give him the first round, because he was kind of snapping Ian Gary's head back more with his own punches, if you want to say that that gave a better impression of damage, I think that's probably fair. So I'd feel good about saying that Gary won the last 10 rounds pretty convincing, or last 2 rounds, last 10 minutes pretty convincingly, because Neal was just, kind of feeding into Ian Gary's game too much, was doing too much like high-fiving and gesturing and talking back, and then doing too much of putting the fight into a wall and stall without really actually doing any damage in those sequences. Gary was doing more of his routine where he likes to skirt the cage and just kind of peck away with kicks and individual strikes and whatnot, and I thought that was enough to get him the win over the last 10 minutes. I didn't quite agree with giving a 30-27, even though that first round still could have been close. But like I said, if you wanted to give Neal that first round just for the strikes he had where he was knocking Gary's head back, I can understand that, even though none of them actually led to knockdowns or any tangible damage on Gary's face. I think 29-28 at worst for Ian Gary is probably the best way to go. So that, I don't think that should have been a split, should have been a unanimous, and that would have been Geoff Neal's last loss. Got submitted by Shavkat Rakhmonov in his first fight in almost a year, and the result prior to that. So Neal has lost 4 of his last 6. He did get a big win over Vicente Luque that kind of reversed all of the momentum Luque had, even though Luque was coming off a loss to Belal Muhammad in his fight prior to that. And he did get a split decision win over Santiago Ponzinibbio, although Ponzinibbio's performances in subsequent UFC events have since kind of lightened the luster that result otherwise gave Geoff Neal, coming off of his first 2-fight losing streak of his entire MMA career after he lost a main event to Stephen Thompson and then lost to Neil Magny in a fight that he frankly got dominated in. Conversely, Rafael dos Anjos is 32-16. He was a massive underdog against Mateusz Gamrot at UFC 299. I advocated staying away from that fight just because I didn't really trust Gamrot's striking success against RDA. Despite I did like that RDA was going back down to lightweight. And the interesting thing about RDA's appearance prior to that against Luque was where I thought Luque was going to have more striking success against RDA given the stage that they were at in their careers. Luque actually opted to go for a more clinch wrestling heavy approach in that fight that ended up rewarding him, and RDA actually held a better account of himself on the feet and was able to win some of the later rounds in that fight than I think people were otherwise expecting. So it was kind of a, my overall read was correct, but the reasons for the fight actually playing out the way that it did ended up being the opposite, I think, of what myself and a lot of other people expected. But because RDA held a better account of himself in the striking in that fight, I advocated for staying away against Gamrot, and I believe 2 of the judges gave dos Anjos the first round at least against Gamrot because he did end up getting that knockdown. And, Gamrot, despite the fact that he's never been knocked out, has now suffered knockdowns, I think, in something like 6 of his last 7 UFC appearances, including the most recent split decision loss he had to Dan Hooker. So that I advocated staying away from that one too. So that, it's been a lot of stayaways just given the state of where RDA's at in his MMA career by now. And this is another one I'm staying away from, so I don't have much more to say on it than that. Neal, I pointed this out in the replies for the pick that I put out this week, but Neal really is one of the most notorious weight bullies at welterweight. He puts on something nearly like 20% of his body weight back after these weight cuts. He weighed over 200 pounds when he fought Ian Gary on fight day, according to the records released by the California State Athletic Commission. So he's a guy that at welterweight is 200 pounds, over 200 pounds on fight day, so 30 pounds above where he is, where he's weighing in. And he's fighting a guy in RDA that's always kind of been an undersized lightweight of sorts, now moving up to a class at welterweight that I frankly don't think he should really be competing in. And I think he's just doing that at this stage because he's 39 years old, and it's just an easier cut for him than having to do so down to the lightweight limit. It's just easier on his body. So the problem is Neal, even though he figures, a lot of people I'm hearing really like Geoff Neal in this spot, and I think it's very, very favorable matchmaking for him. Neal, the fight IQ issues that he showed against Gary and in performances even prior to that, it's just too easy for me to picture a situation in which he kind of psychs himself out, similar to like Kyler Phillips last week, where, you know, it's possible he has some success early, but just for whatever reason kind of stalls out in the second and third rounds as he did against Ian Gary, and isn't making enough of an impression in the striking to where he should otherwise put a fight away that he otherwise was having more success in the beginning. So I think it is possible that RDA ends up having a better performance here than people are expecting. Neal's just not showing enough activity, and RDA ends up getting a decision over Geoff Neal going the distance. At the same time, RDA is somebody that has suffered 3 knockouts in his career at this point, and is somebody that is fighting a guy that, if he wanted to, could go up to light heavyweight without really having a cut. And that's just not a good matchup for RDA whatsoever at this stage in his career. So I'm going to say that Neal ends up getting I'll say it's a second round knockout. I don't think he's gotten, he's gotten I think second round knockout is probably appropriate. He's only had 1 knockout in the first round in his UFC career, and that was against Mike Perry in 2019. His knockout against Luque was in the 3rd round. He's got second round knockouts against Nico Price and Frank Camacho prior to that, and he's got 1 first round submission too. But I don't see him going to the ground with RDA here at all. I think he just keeps this standing and tries to land power shots. And even though people betting on Neal are probably going to be wanting him to put in more of a more volume heavy approach, given the advantages that he has in size in this fight, which go further than just weight. He's going to be 3 inches taller and have a 5-inch reach advantage on top of being 6 years younger. And I think that people are probably going to look at them at the face-off and see the physically imposing size difference, and more money is probably going to even come in on Neal at this point. But I do think there's too much juice on him. I won't be surprised if RDA wins by decision, just because of what we've seen of Geoff Neal kind of psyching himself out in these fights. But RDA is going to turn 40 on fight day, which, it's a hell of a happy birthday present from the UFC for a guy turning 40 to throw him in there with a guy that of Geoff Neal's size. So I think Neal wins by second round knockout, but I wouldn't bet this just because there's a very likely, I think more than the odds would imply, situation in which RDA wins something like a 29-28 split decision here. So the main card opener for UFC 308 is Shara Butin Magomedov and Armen Petrosyan. Shara Bullet enters 14-0 after last appearing at the regular UFC Abu Dhabi, which was Sandhagen versus Nurmagomedov back in August, about 3 months ago at this point, at the very beginning of August, where he beat Mikhail Aleksandar by unanimous decision. I believe Shara took the first 2 rounds of that fight. He did get 2 30-27s. I think there was I think the judge that gave the 29-28 gave Aleksandar the last round, if memory serves correct, because Aleksandar did have some late takedown success. And there were some people that, believe that Oleksiejczuk should have gotten rewarded for a knockdown in the first round that didn't really get scored to him, which I think the fact that it didn't should kind of factor into your consideration of the kind of graceful judging, or at least perceptions, that Shara is going to be getting fighting in an environment like this, which was something I tried to account for when I made him a parlay leg and profited on UFC Abu Dhabi earlier this year. Conversely, Armen Petrosyan hasn't fought since February, when he lost by submission to Rodolfo Vieira. I believe I put out Vieira as an underdog in that fight, and I was pretty confident in Vieira's ability to win that event, just because I didn't expect Petrosyan's takedown defense has been pretty bad, and I expected Vieira to be able to exploit that pretty early, and the fact that he had been willing to give up his back in previous fights was not something that you want to do against a grappler of Vieira's caliber, and Vieira was able to get a first-round submission on him. But obviously most people that were picking Petrosyan in that fight, that kind of bounced back and forth between being a pick'em, I think, were expecting Petrosyan to just kind of outpoint Vieira on the feet, and Vieira didn't really give him the opportunity to do that. But prior to that, got a big upset win over Christian Leroy Duncan, who at the time was an undefeated UK prospect, as I alluded to earlier in the show, about those guys kind of trying to be propped up and having their perception of their abilities inflated a little bit. He also beat AJ Dobson. I believe he was favored to win that fight at UFC 280, so this is Petrosyan's second pay-per-view appearance on a card out of Abu Dhabi. I believe 280 was at Abu Dhabi. It was certainly in the Middle East. Yes, it was. It was in Abu Dhabi. So this is Petrosyan's Abu Dhabi return, if you will. There's a lot of people that are, saying, oh, Shara, he's just going to get fraud checked here. Petrosyan's the more legitimate kickboxer. I'm not really seeing the fraud stuff with Shara relative to the striking. If you want to say that the guy's ground game really isn't there, I can more understand that. And I think that at this weight class, like a middleweight, look, if you made Shara go against a guy like Fluffy or Bo Nickel, yeah, he'd probably get exposed pretty badly. But part of the reason that I felt good about playing him against Oleksiejczuk was because, for exactly what ended up playing out, Oleksiejczuk could have had more success against him on the ground if he had opted to go that route earlier in the fight. He just didn't show the willingness to. And because he didn't do that, he ended up losing all of the rounds in the eyes of two of the judges. Otherwise, he could have potentially made that a split decision if he had opted to wrestle a little bit earlier in that fight than he did, or at least gotten the fight to the ground earlier than he did. So I think that, there's going to come a point when Magomedov fights somebody that's more effective at middleweight at getting takedowns, that he's probably going to get exposed in that department. I don't doubt that. What this one comes down to more against someone like Petrosyan is, do you value the output and efficiency that Magomedov has shown in his UFC appearances more than the more defensive discipline that Petrosyan has? And if attrition was even here, I think I'd probably be a little bit more conciliatory to Petrosyan. But the thing is, this is a guy in Petrosyan that has been knocked out in almost the first minute of a fight prior to him getting to the UFC. So we know that this guy has the potential capacity to get chinned. Now, he took a ton of damage in the fight with RoboCop and still ended up getting a split decision there. So this guy's ability to at least grind through a fight in which he's gotten hurt and go the distance, I think it has to make you feel a little bit good about playing him here. But the other side of this is that I do think Magomedov has shown more devastating power than Petrosyan has at any point in his own MMA career. if you go watch that knockout, his knockout on Contender Series, which is the only finish he's had in the UFC to this point, was more set up by a head kick. If you go back and watch the one-punch knockout that he had in the fight before he went on Contender Series, that it's one of the most suspect results that you will see, to the point that I believe Sherdog was even at a point disputing the legitimacy of it. The guy gets hit and then basically just decides that he doesn't want to fight anymore. It's a very, very, very suspect result that I'm surprised is still considered a legitimate one on Petrosyan's record. So I do think that there's just more overall factors here that make you feel good about Magomedov in the spot. This is a guy that, in an era when the UFC doesn't really have a lot of star power, this is a guy that it does feel like they want to prop up as a character a little bit. You know, already talked about earlier in the show how they gave him kind of the setup spot against Brunno Silva last year. He's already been in a co-main event for one of their fight night events that they've hosted out of this region earlier this year, and now they're throwing him onto the main card of a pay-per-view against a guy that presumably isn't going to try to take him down based on his previous UFC history. They're giving him the opportunity to fight his most entertaining fight, and he's somebody that they are not able to legally have fight in the United States because of the fact that he's legally blind in one of his eyes. So the fact that they're having him fight in a country that doesn't really have an MMA commission, he's somebody that they at least, think they see a little bit of star potential in, still has the undefeated record on him. If this fight does go the distance and it's close, you would think that they're going to give Magomedov the same grace in the judging and the perception that they did when he fought Oleksiejczuk, in terms of giving him that undisputed dominant decision. I think that this probably ends up going the distance. I could see Petrosyan maybe outpointing him in one of the rounds, and then Magomedov maybe adjusting. It's probably 1-1 going into the third, and then Magomedov's better activity ends up just giving him the decision. There's some people that have speculated on his gas tank. I don't really think that I think that the Oleksiejczuk fight kind of proved that wasn't really an issue, just because, his output never really let up in not only that fight, but any of his other ones that he had. Like I said, there's going to come a time when a more well-rounded MMA fighter is going to eventually give this guy his first loss at this level. But Petrosyan hasn't proven that he's that guy. Petrosyan doesn't have any submission wins. He's landing the takedowns that he has gotten. He's averaging less than a quarter of a takedown per 15 minutes in his UFC career, and he's only landing those at a 33% clip, which is it's pretty close to average actually for the average UFC fighter, but the rate at which he's landing them is way, way, way below, which speaks to a very low amount of attempts and tries to do that. And, I think that you have to look at this and think the UFC gave him this matchup, even though Petrosyan is a sophisticated kickboxer in his own right, because this is going to be a guy that's not going to try to stall the fight out from being standing exchanges. It's just going to be a straight-up kickboxing bout for 15 minutes. And I think that given the activity level that Shara Bullets demonstrated, that's going to be more conducive to his success. So I'll say Magomedov gets a 29-28 decision win here. I'm feeling pretty good about him, given this feels like a pretty solid promotional setup spot for him here. I think that they definitely see more in terms of a future with this guy than they do out of Petrosyan. So give me Magomedov to win by unanimous decision in what could be a closer fight than that implies, but I expect him to get graceful judging in this environment, regardless of what the result is. The next fight is Lerone Murphy and Dan Ige. Lerone Murphy enters 14-0-1 after the arguably greatest performance of his MMA career to date thus far. Back in May, his first main event at Fight Night Barboza versus Murphy, in which he got a nearly unanimous 50-45 decision over Barboza in what was kind of a letdown performance for Barboza, even at 38 years old. Barboza, I think, was able to get maybe the last round or at least one of the rounds in there in the eyes of one of the judges. But either way, it was still a pretty... I thought Murphy won 50-45, but it was and I picked Murphy to win, but it was pretty clearly a one-way traffic decision in favor of Murphy in what was kind of a showing out performance for him. Conversely, Dan Ige is the apple of the UFC brass's eye after he, in an event that was plagued by several dropouts in so many of the high-profile bouts on the main card for UFC 303, Brian Ortega pulls out due to illness after the weigh-ins, after already negotiating the fight to be up a weight class or a catch weight from what it otherwise would have been against Diego Lopez. The UFC needs to move heaven and earth to keep Lopez on the main card after Ortega pulls out, and Dan Ige comes to the rescue as the local Vegas guy training out of Extreme Couture and says, yeah, I got you. I'll weigh in on the day of, and I'll get us I'll make sure that this fight stays on, in what was a truly unprecedented circumstance for not only the UFC, but I think most MMA promotions in general. And Ige, I think, gave a very good account of himself. Lopez obviously had the more well-rounded skill set, and I think was more prepared for a pay-per-view fight, obviously, than Ige was. But Ige obviously ended up giving a more competitive fight to Lopez, who's now the number 3 ranked fighter in the featherweight division, on hours' notice than what Ortega did when that fight got rebooked for UFC 306. Ige lost the first 10 minutes, but was able to make enough adjustments against Lopez. And you can say, well, because Lopez was fighting, a couple weight classes up from what he's normally used to, maybe that additional weight on his body kind of affected his cardio a bit to where that's more of the reason that he lost the final round and hadn't really been able to prepare for what Ige was going to be able to do as opposed to preparing for the fight with Ortega. Either way, Ige still gave a pretty dominant, not to a 10-8, but pretty convincingly won the final round of his fight with Diego Lopez, despite losing that unanimous decision that impressed a lot of people. And Ige, won the hearts of a lot of fans that night and obviously got a nice bag from the UFC. So it's interesting that, the company man doing this favor for them, they then follow that up by rewarding him with a not even a featured bout at this point on the 308 card, and instead give him a undefeated UK prospect in Lerone Murphy. And the numbers, if you're just going strictly off of what those are, tell you that Murphy should probably win this, right? I mean, Murphy's going to have a slight but still statistically significant 2.5-inch reach advantage, which is like the cutoff for being significant. You want to see 2.5 or greater in terms of guys being able to stay measured. Lands more volume at a greater efficiency than Ige does. His differential on strikes is also better. Is absorbing much less. They're defensively about the same level of efficiency, but Ige is, still absorbing more blows. Murphy's also landing more takedowns at twice the amount of efficiency that Ige is. Really, Ige's only advantages in terms of statistical success relative to what I look at are better takedown defense. Murphy's takedown defense is actually pretty far below average. Ige's is right around the average for what you would expect for a UFC fighter. And Ige's also got 3 times as many finishes, but he also has much more experience in the UFC in general than Murphy does, despite the fact that both these guys are about the same age. And Ige's also got nearly twice as much experience going the distance. So experience is really the only edge that I see for Ige here, but that was also true of Rob Font last week when he was fighting against Kyler Phillips. So make of that what you will. But I actually think in terms of bringing that up, there's a lot. I'm not picking Ige to beat Murphy because of Rob Font beating Kyler Phillips. It's, two different fights, even though I think that there's similarities that you can draw between the two of them. I don't think Murphy has the same problem with like mentally psyching himself out that Phillips has, but I do think that there is a pretty significant difference in terms of level of competition here that, you can say between Murphy and Ige. I mean, 70% of Ige's entire MMA career has taken place in the UFC at this point. That's unbelievable. His most recent performance was against the fighter that's now ranked number 3 in the rankings, and the only other guys that he's really lost to have all been guys that Bryce Mitchell's more fringe, but I think that he gets disrespected more than he probably deserves just because he got nuked by Josh Emmett. And, Topuria put the whooping on him too. But Mitchell's a guy who, given the style of fight that he has, I think is probably more deserving of being seen towards the top of the division than he otherwise probably is getting credit for recently, even though we haven't seen him fight since that life-changing knockout that Emmett put on him at the end of last year. But Mitchell notwithstanding, I mean, Ige's lost to Movsar Evloev, Josh Emmett, the Korean Zombie before Zombie really started going into the fall off, and Calvin Kattar before Kattar really started going into his own fall off, and lost his UFC debut to Julio Arce, who I believe, I'm not sure if that fight was at featherweight, but Arce is a guy that I think a lot of people would consider pretty underrated given the skill set that he has. So Arce notwithstanding, this is a guy that really only loses to fighters that are up towards the top of the division. Murphy, I don't think it's a question that the best fight he had in terms of competition was the last one, and it was Edson Barbosa in the twilight of Barbosa's career at 38 years old, so very firmly in the decline stage. There were people, because of that narrative about the older fighters getting, a boost from the lack of USADA enforcement, to start this year, that he was going to have more of a showing out performance, and that ended up really just being a big letdown. And I think people were also encouraged by the performance that Barbosa had against Yusuf that didn't really end up aging well given Yusuf's subsequent performance against Diego Lopez. But I mean, I don't think that you can dispute at this point that Murphy's win over Barbosa, as good as it is, it's not like he was fighting Barbosa at the peak of his powers the way that you might be able to more firmly advocate that Ige did when Ige got a split decision over Barbosa in May of 2020. So I don't think that you can dispute here that Ige's fought the higher level of competition, and that this fight is probably going to be closer for that reason than you would otherwise expect. If Ige was more firmly into the twilight of his career at this point, even though I know Ige's had a lot of attrition in his own right, I would be more understanding. But Ige's still somebody that's never been finished either in his own right. So you have to imagine that this fight is going to go the distance. But even if you're looking at it in terms of a finishing perspective, I don't know how you can look at this and say that Ige doesn't have the edge in punching power and ability to hurt his opponent over Lerone Murphy. Murphy definitely, I think, has the more well-rounded skill set relative to striking. I think he's probably going to have more effectiveness with kicks and whatnot. But, I mean, Ige, we've seen the guy, his nickname is 50K for a reason. The guy has put the lights out on multiple people during his UFC run. Most recently, his fight prior to his hours notice appearance to Diego Lopez when he fought Andre Fili, and granted, Fili's somebody that had been knocked out before himself, but I think the most notable knockout he had prior to, or knockout loss prior to losing to Ige was Joe Anderson Brito. So he had already, shown a propensity for being cracked, but point is, Ige's shown the ability to put the lights out on people in a way that Murphy really hasn't. The fight where, I think the hype really started to come in on Murphy, and if you go back and look, you might say, oh, well, when he fought, I believe it was It was either Terry Doyle or Nathan Thompson, but I think it was Terry Doyle. He is listed as having a one-punch knockout credited in that fight. But when I talk about scrutinizing or having to more closely scrutinize the circumstances of what led to a fighter having that one-punch knockout, you really got to be look at the details of that. I believe Terry Doyle hadn't fought in a year and a half going into that fight against Murphy. And not only that, but his last appearance was up. He had been a traditional lightweight, moved up to welterweight, and then fought Murphy at featherweight after taking a year and a half off. So had been knocked out in multiple previous appearances prior to facing Murphy at higher weight classes, had fought up at welterweight, and then took 25 pounds off of his chin to fight Murphy off of a year and a half hiatus and got knocked out by Murphy. I mean, that tells me that guy should not have been fighting in that weight class against an opponent like Murphy. And Murphy doesn't have any other one-punch, lights-out knockouts in his career since that one. So I think that Ige pretty firmly has the power advantage here. And Murphy has been knocked down in the UFC before. In his his UFC debut, it happened against Zabario Tukagov, and it was a big reason why that fight ended in a draw. And he's had letdown performances in his own right before, despite the fact that he's still undefeated. The Gabriel Santos fight is one that a lot of people believe Santos won that fight and that Murphy only got a split decision because of hometown cooking, because UFC 286 was obviously in the UK, and the UK wanted to protect their undefeated prospects. So I do think that people are overvaluing Murphy in this spot because he is this, undefeated UK prospect coming off of the best performance of his MMA career, albeit against a fighter who was pretty clearly in the decline stage and twilight of their MMA career. I don't think that's where Ige is. And I think Ige has shown a liveliness and game enough ability that I wish this fight were 5 rounds, because then I'd feel really good about taking him here. But I am going to be taking Ige under the impression that I think he's going to get at least one knockdown in this fight. I would hope that he's able to start faster than he did against Lopez, and that Murphy is not going to try to implement any sort of wrestling or ground game approach here. I think if Murphy does do a good job of mixing things up, that he probably will end up getting a decision win here. But I'm going to say that Ige gets an early knockdown. I think Murphy battles back and wins the second round, but I think Ige has enough reads made by the time he goes into the third round, having the Extreme Couture personnel in his corner. I think he's going to get a little bit better coaching than what Murphy is getting, I believe, with Manchester Top Team. I think that Ige is going to have the reads help made to where he's able to have the more effective striking down the stretch, and is able to get a 29-28 upset over Lerone Murphy at UFC 308. So I think the knockout upside here has to belong to Ige too, given neither of these guys have been finished. Murphy doesn't have a submission win in his MMA career, so I think you might even have to give the submission upside to Ige in this spot too, even though I don't really expect Ige to get the fight to the ground underneath under a circumstance that isn't something like a club and sub. But I think you have to like the finishing side upside for Ige here. If you're betting Murphy, you're kind of banking on him just cruising to a decision win, and I don't think it's going to be as easy for him as it was against Barboza. So give me Dan Ige to spring the pretty big upset here and finish off a big win for Mr. 50K. The featured bout for UFC 308 is Magomed Ankalaev and Aleksandar Rakić. Ankalaev is coming off a win at the first UFC event of the year in which he headlined Ankalaev Walker 2, which was the follow-up to the no contest that these guys had at UFC 294 last year, which I believe was in Abu Dhabi. That is correct. In which Walker having, I think, more success. I picked Walker to win as an underdog in both cases. Obviously was way wrong in the second fight, but in the first fight I think was having more success than people gave credit for at first. I believe got poked in the eye which was what led to the no contest in the first fight. And the when the doctor asked him, what country are you in or where are you, and Walker really just couldn't remember the name of Abu Dhabi, or that he was in the United Arab Emirates, just opted to say the desert. And the the doctor wanted to stop the fight under those circumstances. They were like, no, come on, man, what are you doing? It was just a bizarre result. I was kind of hoping softly it was like, oh, are they going to give the DQ or whatever? But I figured, no, they don't want to see Ankalaev have his run of success sullied under those circumstances. So they declared it a no contest, rebooked it for the first Apex event of this year. And Ankalaev got a big knockout, albeit over an opponent that has kind of proven at this point to have very toxic damage tolerance in Walker. But it was a good bounce back result for Ankalaev in some respects, after not having had an official result since his draw against Jan Blachowicz at UFC 282, all the way back at the end of 2022. So he comes into this one against Rakić, who is 14-4. Obviously was starting to kind of find his groove against Jan Blachowicz before blowing out his knee, being sidelined for nearly 2 years. He comes back at UFC 300 in, I believe, what was the featured prelim against Yuri Prochazka. What was kind of a title eliminator fight for those two in terms of the next guy to what ended up being the next guy to face Ferreira, because Blachowicz ended up getting the rematch with Ferreira after Hill fought Ferreira at 300, and then they had to kind of rebook. They were planning on doing Prochazka versus Ferreira at, I believe, 305, and then because of the McGregor pullout at 303, they had to expedite that process because both guys were good with it, and then they ended up moving that fight up to 303. That's what happened. So you would think that if Rakić had won that fight, he would have been in the position that Prochazka was in, where he could have potentially fought for the belt at 303. In any event, Rakić did, despite, I think, unanimously winning the first round against Prochazka and really teeing off on him on leg kicks in a way that Ferreira was ultimately able to exploit as well. Rakić did get wobbled by Yuri, just kind of going madman mode and coming back in that fight, and ended up grinding through the adversity to find a comeback TKO win in the second round in a fight that was pretty effectively a pick'em the whole way through. Magomed Ankalaev is like an enormous favorite in pretty much every fight that he's in at this point, which I think is kind of curious, given he gets like lauded for his wrestling ability, even though he's only averaging one takedown per 15 minutes and has never won by submission in his entire MMA career. So I think he kind of just gets anointed for having wrestling credentials because he's a Russian that has Magomed in his name. I think he's pretty much overvalued in every fight that he has, despite the fact that he's had the success that he has in his entire MMA career, and really has only ever lost in the final seconds of a fight he was otherwise winning when he got triangled, I believe, by Paul Craig in his UFC debut. So I don't really have a lot to say about this one. I just kind of have the same read that everybody else does, which is that, Ankalaev really didn't show much of an interest in checking or guarding himself from leg kicks against Blachowicz, and Blachowicz was able to get a draw in that fight predominantly because he was just able to really kick Ankalaev's legs out from under him for the first 15 minutes. So this fight's only 3 rounds. So you would figure that he shows a little bit more urgency than he did in that case. But the big result previously in his career that kind of stands out to me in terms of him being a slow starter was his fight with Nikita Krylov, where he ended up winning at 29-28, but Krylov was able to win the first round against him. And he's shown in a lot of other circumstances that it really takes him a little bit to get going. And I think Rakić having the first round that he did against Yuri and being known as a guy that has some of the most devastating leg kicks in the UFC, he's going to be very, very heavy on that approach. And if he can just avoid getting nuked by Ankalaev early, he's going to have a very, very easy path to keeping himself in this fight. And he's going to have a 3-inch reach advantage that he can help use to keep this fight at his preferred kicking range, to where if he does have that early leg kick success, and he's able to kind of neutralize Ankalaev's ability to move in and land damage in the pocket, then he can avoid getting chinned. And if he presumably is able to take away one more round in the second before Ankalaev's really able to get going, what ends up happening to the result here? You still have to imagine that Ankalaev is going to get favorable judging, and Rakic's leg kick heavy game plan, even in fights where it's been successful before, hasn't necessarily played out well with the judges in the past. I thought that he should have gotten the win over Volkan Oezdemir, but Oezdemir ended up getting the split decision in that case. That was the first and only loss going the distance for Rakić in his entire MMA career, and only the second loss of his MMA career in general to that point. So I can understand the people that are betting on Rakić here. I just think that Ankalaev still is probably the slightly more well-rounded, and if it wasn't for that very transparent flaw that he's demonstrated in previous appearances, I'd probably feel more comfortable with picking him here. The line on him has come down a little bit from what it was earlier this week. He was out to the 400 range. Now he's starting to dip into the 3. I think he was around 350, but now I'm looking at it again. He's bouncing back up to 385. So there's still obviously a lot of people that feel very good about his result here. I do think he's going to end up getting something like a 29-28 decision here. But it really would not surprise me at all if Rakić is able to steal the first 10 minutes and Ankalaev just runs out of time being able to he just takes too long to get going and ends up fumbling this result. I think the UFC would much rather see Rakić fight Ferreira than Ankalaev. And it wouldn't surprise me if Ankalaev is favored over Ferreira if the winner of this fight ends up fighting for the title, which I think you can probably say this fight is going to end up being a title eliminator. But, give me Magomed Ankalaev to win by unanimous decision. I just don't expect a super entertaining fight, and I don't think that Ankalaev should be favored at the price that he is, just because I don't think is proven to be as well-rounded as this price would imply, even though I do think he probably has the slightly more well-rounded skill set here than what Rakić has demonstrated. The co-main event at UFC 308 is Khamzat Chimaev and Robert Whittaker. This fight was originally supposed to be the main event at UFC Saudi Arabia. Chimaev had to pull out due to a medical issue, some kind of illness. They gave Whittaker a matchup with Ikram Aliskerov to try to save that, and Whittaker was favored to win. I took Aliskerov as an underdog, and Whittaker had his most impressive performance in years, frankly. Probably his most impressive knockout since the one he had not even knockout, most impressive fight he's had since he knocked out Derek Brunson all the way back in 2016. Whittaker's going to enter 27-7 off of that result. And I think it's ended up being very fortuitous for the UFC that it's kind of played out the way that it did, because even though this fight would have had a lot of hype going into UFC Saudi Arabia, the hype that it has now that Whittaker has had that kind of enormous, you don't want to quite call it a bounce back because he did win the unanimous decision over Paulo Costa, but him showing that kind of punching power that he did against Aleksandar has made this, I think, a much more compelling close result than it would have been otherwise for Whittaker going in against Chimaev back at the end of June. Chimaev is still 13-0, hasn't fought since October of last year. I believe he was in the co-main event for UFC 294, in which he beat Kamaru Usman by majority decision in a fight that most people believe that Chimaev won. I do think that he deserved a 10-8 for the smothering that he gave in the first round against Usman. Usman did, I believe, unanimously get awarded the second round. The third round, I think, did deservingly go to Chimaev. But there's so many people that just despise Chimaev that wanted to just give that fight to Usman. And I think that if that fight had ended up being a 5-round main event, it would have been really interesting to see how, or 5 rounds generally. I think it would have been interesting to see. Usman probably would have ended up maybe grinding out a win there just based on how things went, but I don't think there's any question that Chimaev won that fight. And I think that people that are trying to make a case for Usman winning that fight are probably the same people that wanted to make a case for Gilbert Burns getting the decision over Chimaev at UFC 273. Now, before I get into why I think Chimaev is going to win this one, I do just kind of want to address the state of the UFC generally, because this promotion, in a way that I didn't really anticipate being the case 2 years ago, is currently really starved for stars. It says something that the biggest star the promotion has right now is a guy that does not speak fluent English in Alex Pereira. I don't think anybody anticipated Izzy having the kind of fall from grace that he has, particularly given the result that he had at UFC 287 last year. I think that the UFC is quietly kind of hoping that Holloway gets the win here, because he was a guy that prior to the trilogy with Volkanovski, I think was heading for his own Mount Rushmore status in terms of UFC history until he kind of met his match and his rival there, that he never ended up getting a win over. And even if he ends up winning against here, is potentially going to be staring down a 4th fight against an opponent that he's never beaten. But we'll get into Holloway after this one. The reason I'm bringing that up is because I don't know if enough people in the U.S. really appreciate, the kind of global phenomenon that Chimaev is, and the star potential that the guy has, even in spite of all the layoffs that he does. I think that speaks to why the UFC was willing to put up with the fact that the guy totally blew his weight at UFC 279 and nearly destroyed the main event, or basically did destroy the main event for that card, that forced the UFC to kind of reshuffle the top 3 fights on the pay-per-view within 24 hours in a really unprecedented circumstance back for that one. I mean, the UFC has proven that even if you're an undefeated prospect, despite your star potential, they'll let go of you if you end up being too much of a headache. It's exactly what just happened with Muhammad Mokaev. There's a bar in Miami that I started going to watch the pay-per-views right after, shortly after I started doing this analysis in 2022. And the first time I went there was for UFC 273, which was the first pay-per-view after the infamous run that I went on. I talked about from the fight night in London that extended over to UFC Columbus, where I was on something like an 18 straight pick streak that extended over into UFC 273 with Alexei Oleinik's win over Jared Vanderaa when Oleinik was an underdog. My streak finally got snapped because I took the over at plus odds on Mickey Gall versus Mike Malone. So that was disappointing to see. But I had some pretty good other breeds that night. I didn't end up doing too well on that event just because, I had Peter Yan as a parlay leg. He ends up losing by split decision to Aljamain Sterling. One of the other picks that I had on that fight night, or that pay-per-view, was the under for Khamzat Chimaev's fight versus Gilbert Burns, because you pretty much have to hedge on Chimaev under every circumstance because he's rarely getting a playable price given the opponent that he's facing. And the thing that I remember, and I kept going to that bar very routinely. That was when I was in my first apartment in Miami, the one that I was at earlier this year where I was, recording some of the RAXPOD, or that all of the RAXPODs were recorded out of, that you got to see the view for in the background starting this year. And that view was also, what I made the backdrops for the RAXPODs that I started doing last year. But through both of those apartments that I had in Miami, I was still going to that bar for the pay-per-views pretty consistently. And, I'd always get there, to start watching the early prelims, and there wouldn't be usually too many people there. But because they were one of the only places that were paying to have the pay-per-view on, almost always the place was filling up by the time it was ready for the main card to get going. But in the 2 years that I was going there for pay-per-views, there had never been a more raucous reception for any fighter than when I was there for the first time and Khamzat Chimaev fought Gilbert Burns. And seemingly out of nowhere, all of these, most of whom I suspected to be Muslim fans, were coming out of the woodwork to scream their head off and cheer for Chimaev. And I had been talking to other people about the various picks that I had that were sitting around me for the card. But when Chimaev fought, people, because they wanted to see the screens better, started working themselves into, the crevices between bar stools where, people usually are cutting in to order drinks and then go back to their table or whatever. But yet people were getting. And one guy that knew I had been picking, fights and stuff, turned to me and kind of like angrily, he was like, "You pick Khamzat? You pick Khamzat?" I was like, yeah. I said I took the under because I thought, Chimaev was too expensive, but I took the under because I'm expecting Chimaev to finish Gilbert early. And he nearly did in the first round of that fight, but it didn't end up taking place. But when the decision was read for Chimaev, I remember the place just exploding with joy. I remember a lot of people that bet on Gilbert being disappointed are like, man, I felt like Gilbert won that fight. And I was in Miami, so, Gilbert's a guy that fights out of South Florida, so he had his own contingent of supporters pretty firmly there. But nobody, I was there for when Izzy fought, I think it was 276 or 277. I think it was 276 when Izzy fought Cannonier, and Volk fought Holloway for the third time that time too. There were a lot of people there that were supporting Holloway. That place never, ever got the kind of pop that it did the way it did when Chimaev fought in a fight that was a featured, it wasn't even the co-main of 273, it was the featured bout. This guy Chimaev is one of the biggest potential stars that the UFC still has at this current state in time. And I think that they really, really do want to protect that asset here. So I think you really, really need to take that into consideration relative to the fact that we've already seen Whittaker make runs for the title. We've already seen him lose to Izzy twice in this division. We've already seen him get pretty thoroughly dominated by the current champion Duplessis. I think that the UFC wants to protect their asset here in Chimaev, and you've really got to take that into consideration in a country that doesn't have a commission where it feels like the judges can be pretty easily influenced, in an environment where Chimaev's already going to have the crowd on his side anyway. Now, and the last thing that I'll say too, just relative to all that, is that, or the recent performances from Chimaev, is that I do think some of the cardio concerns are overblown. It was 1-1 going into the third of the Gilbert Burns fight, and he won that fight because he got the third round over Gilbert Burns. It was 1-1, potentially a 10-8 and a 10-9 which I think it should have been, but, I think at least one judge, which is why it ended up being a majority, saw it as 10-9, 10-9 going into the third against Usman. Chimaev was going to need to win that round in order to get the result, and he did. Now, again, this is a 5-round fight, not a 3-round fight, but fighters prepare accordingly when they know they're going to be going into a fight that is going to be 10 extra minutes more than what they would have to allot for a normal MMA fight under more normal circumstances. So, Chimaev understands that he's got to prepare for the championship rounds here, and I think that's part of the reason he's been training at Russia's Olympic Center as opposed to staying in the United Arab Emirates or going back to, I believe it was Sweden, where he was previously fighting out of. He's been training at elevation because he knows it's going to be a 5-round fight. And yeah, Whittaker has the more built-in experience going the distance, and I think that is one of the few advantages he's going to have here. But, part of the reason that I wanted to hedge on rounds when Whittaker fought Costa at 298 was because I didn't expect Costa to give, if Costa made it kind of a brawl and not just the purely Whittaker at this stage, it's pretty clear that he wants to just keep things at a technical skirting kickboxing outpointing pace. He's really good at that, and that's how he's beaten a lot of his opponents recently. It's part of the reason why the Aleksandar result was as impressive as it was, because he didn't even need to outpoint him there. He just, as a lot of people like to say, picked up Alescarov's timing right away and was able to knock him out accordingly. Chimaev is not going to allow himself to be outpointed for, it could happen for potentially a round or two. It's not going to happen for 25 minutes. And if Whittaker wants to win here, it's going to need to happen for 15 minutes. Whittaker's not going to get the better of this guy on the ground. Chimaev is a mauler. He just is. He's a relentless kind of pressure guy that is capable of putting up these near finishing performances over fighters that are, when Chimaev beat Burns, I think Burns was still number one, if not at least top 3 at welterweight in terms of the rankings. And, Usman is one of the most dominant champions that weight class had. He obviously took it on short notice, but we've never seen anybody give Usman a 10-8 the way that Chimaev did. The guy really is just he's putting out a pressure on there that championship level fighters are not used to having to deal with. And Whittaker is a guy that has been caught before. And he's a guy that when he's had to deal with that kind of pressure, even recently, I'm not saying Du Plessis puts on the same level of pressure that Chimaev does, but when he had to fight that kind of muddy waters fight that I spoke about when I did the breakdown with Du Plessis and Whittaker, that Du Plessis wasn't going to allow Whittaker to fight his preferred style, Whittaker ended up wilting. And I just kind of expect the same thing to happen here. I think Chimaev is just going to come out and really, really put it on the guy bad. I don't know if it's going to be a 10-8. I don't know if it's going to be a first-round finish. But I do expect him to put Whittaker away within the first 10 minutes. If that doesn't happen, the longer this fight goes, the more I think you have to like it for Whittaker. But Chimaev has proven that even when he isn't able to get the championship level fighters out of there as quickly as he would like, he can still put himself in a position to win one more round and end up getting the victory in the eyes of the judges. So I think that he's going to win the first 10 minutes. I think it's possible Whittaker ends up getting the third round after that if the fight goes that long. But I expect Chimaev to get at least one of the championship rounds without totally exhausting himself if the fight does go the distance and end up getting a 48-47, possibly 48-46, depending on how bad the first round is, decision win that potentially makes some of the fans, particularly the ones that want Whittaker to win, or the ones that just outright hate Chimaev, of which there are many, and part of the reason why he has the star potential that he does, because you do need, people really either love or hate this guy, and like I said, there were plenty of people that wanted to see Chimaev lose against Burns that I saw at that bar too, but I think if this is a close decision, that Chimaev is probably going to get the grace given the environment this fight is taking place in. This fight was in Australia. Might be a different circumstance for Mr. Whittaker. But this fight started outlined at 300, and I think that's probably an appropriate range for Khamzat. So I do like that his price has since fallen down a little bit. I put the pick out at 240. He's gone back up a little bit to 265. He's now back down to 250. I hope that he stays in this range. I don't know how many more playable money lines we're going to get on Chimaev, and this is the first time that I'm able to finally get one where I don't have to hedge on rounds in his career, and I look forward to playing him as a result. So I'm going to say Chimaev gets a second round stoppage. I don't know if it's going to be a knockout or a submission, but I do think that he's going to put it on Whittaker bad enough through the first 10 minutes that he's able to get a stoppage. And I'll say that it happens in the second round. And now we come to the main event. Ilia Topuria and Max Holloway. Topuria is 15-0, was an underdog against Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 298 earlier this year. Dropped the first round to Volk before knocking him out in the second round. Holloway obviously is coming off one of the most spectacular results in a non-title fight. I know it was for the BMF belt, but we're not really calling that a title fight. The UFC doesn't, or the ESPN doesn't have it tabbed as a title fight relative to all the other title fights that Holloway has been in his career. But regardless of that distinction, it was one of the most spectacular endings to any fight, I think, in MMA history, where he pointed to the middle of the canvas and said, let's throw down here if we're really BMFs, and knocked out Gaethje with one punch at UFC 300. I don't think the UFC could have asked for anything better, given the fact that that was their tricentennial event. Obviously, it was just an absolutely sensational moment, and certainly the best moment of the year, I think, in the UFC, without question. And Holloway has since been able to ride that momentum to a featherweight title shot, which I think is pretty deserved. I would have liked to see this fight take place in Spain. I was pretty disappointed when I heard this was originally going to be the main event for UFC 307. I didn't think Salt Lake City was a good place to host an event of this magnitude, which is why I'm more glad that I shouldn't say I'm glad that Makhachev got hurt and that his title fight with Sarukian fell apart, but I am glad in the sense that that fight has since been delayed out to probably early next year, and that the UFC made the wise decision to take the Topuria Holloway title fight and put it onto this card that was already very deep, making this, in my opinion, the deepest card of the year and possibly the best one. This fight is so tough for me because going in, especially coming off of a result where I got Holloway at plus odds against Gaethje, and I felt pretty good about him as an underdog, and then obviously he ended up very much vindicating that performance. I mean, Holloway is somebody that, going back to when I just started casually becoming more interested in the UFC again, that, like I alluded to in the breakdown that I just gave on Chimaev and Whittaker, I really thought that Holloway was on his way prior to the Volkanovski trilogy to being on the Mount Rushmore of the UFC, and I think that a lot of other people would agree with that. I didn't watch the first fight that he had against Volk because if you want to say that I'm one of these people I started watching this when I was in high school, but then took a break for a very long time. I didn't start watching the main events again, consistently of the pay-per-views until COVID. And so one of the first ones that I did catch was when Volk fought Holloway the second time. That was kind of one of the first ones that piqued my interest. The other one was Costa versus Adesanya when they were both undefeated. And I didn't think that, I thought Holloway beat Volk in the second fight, as many people did, and I was very upset that ended up being a split in favor of Volk. I thought, what are you doing, UFC? You just, tarnished the all-time great potential of this guy Holloway, but I'm glad that he's since recovered, and the only guy that he's lost to since, over the course of the last 5 years at this point, really is Volk. So that makes this fight very, very interesting, particularly because Holloway dominated Arnold Allen, dominated Korean Zombie, and granted that was a retirement fight for Zombie, but still dominated, and then dominated Gaethje, a guy up a weight class that he was the underdog in that fight for. So I coming into this, before I ran any of the numbers in my heart, I was just thinking, God, I want to pick Max so bad, and I really hope the numbers end up reflecting that I think that he's got a really good shot here, just because he's had such a great bounce back run. And then I ran the numbers. And Max has the edge in volume and overall UFC finishes, and certainly experience going the distance, but the numbers really reflect why the hype on Topuria is what it is. And I picked Topuria as an underdog to beat Volk, so I was somebody that recognized, look, this guy is good, and Topuria has been the last leg on two of the last 3 sweeps that I've had. So I know, I had known for a long time, Topuria really is as good as he said he is. Now, granted, I played Bryce Mitchell as an underdog against him, and that ended up not being the correct play. But it's not because I doubted how bad Topuria was. I just thought that Bryce was a smothering presence. And it's interesting, I saw some people saying that Mitchell, if for nothing else than the fact that he's a southpaw, was able to give Topuria a bit more hesitation on the feet in that fight than he had perhaps shown in subsequent performances or other performances where he's fought presumably more sophisticated strikers in his career. But yeah, I took him, at 300 to beat Emmett, and he vindicated that price. And when he fought as an underdog against Volk, I remember saying on the breakdown, and you can go back and see it, I think this is a similar situation to Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira, where it's if the guy wins this fight, it's going to be a very long time before you get this similar price on him. Especially if Topuria wins this fight at the value that he is currently. Do you honestly think that you're ever going to get the opportunity to bet Topuria as an underdog ever again, at least in the next 10 years? Because the guy's only 27. The reach here is consistent at 69 inches for both guys, which means Topuria being 4 inches shorter is going to have an easier time finding Holloway's chin. Even though Topuria hits as hard as he does, I don't expect Max to go down, because the guy has, I think him and Kevin Holland have the 2 best chins in the UFC in terms of their ability to tolerate damage. And frankly, I don't really think that it's close. He is going to have the age gap here. It's not as pronounced as it was against Volkanovski, but Holloway is 32 in his prime years, so it's not like it's a super significant thing. But Topuria is going to be 5 years younger at 27. The defensive striking numbers are definitely more in Topuria's favor. Max has never been much of an offensive wrestler, and I think that, if I'm picking Topuria here, I'm doing so with the idea that I want to see him put this fight on the ground and really fight a well-rounded MMA fight. I don't want to see what he did against Volk, where he just kind of took a lot of time to make reads and then eventually took advantage of the fact that Volk had been knocked out in his most recent appearance. Holloway, I think, did get knocked down against Gaethje, even though the stats didn't really count it in favor of Gaethje. But I still don't think that Max has shown at this point that, you know, he's at the position where he's going to get his lights put out, especially after he just faced someone in Gaethje who's a high-volume nuclear hitter. So I would hope that Topuria recognizes that, you know what, Holloway's got really, really solid takedown defense at 84%, but it's not like it's ironclad. And I'm someone that is clearly going to be the more well-rounded fighter, and I need to take advantage of that. And, you know, I just hope that Topuria is going to make this a well-rounded fight. Holloway has been submitted. I believe it was the first time he fought Dustin Poirier in his UFC debut. So even though it stands to reason his grappling or submission defense has improved, obviously he's been lauded for his defensive wrestling, you know, for keeping fights upright throughout his UFC career. I would just still hope that, you know, we haven't seen Topuria really lean on his wrestling and grappling to primarily win any of his recent appearances. Certainly not against Herbert. He got the submission over Mitchell, but I think, if memory serves, that was more of a club and sub. And it's not like he really tried to initiate putting that fight on the ground, even though that, I mean, the fact that he was able to submit a guy as sophisticated on the ground as Mitchell really shows you how good he is in that area. I would just hope that, given that there's more that Topuria, I think, can give on the ground and control the fight than Holloway can deal with, as opposed to on the feet, where if this fight does take place on the feet, if Topuria doesn't, if he's not able to knock down Holloway, I do think that Holloway's going to just kind of be able to pour on volume and make more of an impression that way than Topuria is, particularly based on how his first round against Volk went. So, I mean, Topuria's coming in here, obviously, at peak confidence. He's never lost, go figure, but he's also saying he's, planning on fighting to become a 3-division champ at some point, which, okay, best of luck with that. But I do think that just because there's less that Holloway can give back to Topuria on the ground than there is Topuria can give back to Holloway on the feet, Topuria is the more well-rounded guy here. I think that he is in a pretty appropriate range here of being in 200, given the position that he is to win this. So I am going to be picking Topuria to win. I know this isn't usually as much of a built-out breakdown as I typically go into for these for the main events, but I think this one is pretty straightforward in terms of I am conflicted. My heart does say that I want to pick Holloway and that he is going to be able to get like a 48-47 decision win here and what's going to be an absolute war and reestablish himself as champion and back in the conversation for being on the Mount Rushmore of the UFC by the time it's all said and done. But I do think that Topuria, this is a guy that has proven that he will fight smart and has proven to just be so effective in every area of mixed martial arts that I can't imagine that he doesn't try to put this fight in where it's most advantageous for him to perform, and I think that he's going to be able to win at least 3 of the rounds doing that. So I'll say Topuria gets a 48-47 decision. It won't surprise me if one of the rounds is ambiguous and another judge ends up dissenting for Holloway, but I think that Topuria is going to win this fight predominantly just by being the more well-rounded fighter, controlling at least 3 of the rounds. It's possible he scores a knockdown on Holloway at some point, but I don't expect Topuria to keep this fight predominantly where he knows that Max is going to be able to fight his most effective fight. I would think that a guy of Topuria's fight IQ is going to do his best to take that away from a guy as legendary in this sport as Holloway is. I think it's going to be a war. I don't expect one guy to blow the other out, but I do think that Topuria has more ways to win this fight and is the more well-rounded side here, and that justifies the price tag that he has. And in the same way that I don't think we were going to get him at plus odds again for a very long time against Volk, we might not get him as low as 200 range again if he does win a pretty convincing victory over Holloway here, because I don't know how many other guys are going to be able to give him more of a challenge in this spot in the near future than Blessed. So give me Topuria to win by unanimous decision, but I'm expecting a close fight, one of the fights of the year, and I will be thrilled either way with the result, because I think both of these guys are very high-level performers and great ambassadors for the sport. And that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD. It feels like this came out to probably 3 hours or something. So if you listen to every single one of these breakdowns, thank you very much for doing so. I apologize for not doing the minute-to-minute breakdowns for last week, but we will be back at least for the RAXPOD for UFC 309 next month, which will be 2 days after my birthday. Obviously, that'll feature John Jones, Stipe Miocic, and my hero, my guy Charles Oliveira, rematching Michael Chandler in a fight that I absolutely hate is happening. I really, really, really wish that fight wasn't taking place, because just given the level of attrition that Oliveira has at this stage of his career, and Chandler's finishing potential, I mean, I don't understand why a rematch like that is taking place at lower stakes, and I don't really think that a win for Oliveira in that spot gets him back in the title picture, and I don't really expect him to beat Makhachev anyway at this stage, to be honest. But looking forward to the return of John Jones, looking forward to seeing Bo Nickel against Paul Craig, looking forward to the return of Nikita Krylov, a fighter I really, really enjoy watching and kind of hope is going to get his own shot against Ferreira at some point soon. But in any event, we'll definitely be back with the RAXPOD for that one in a couple of weeks here, and I'll see what I can do about the minute-to-minute breakdowns for Fight Night Moreno-Albazi, as well as Vegas Apex 100 Magny Pratis. Yippee. So thank you very much for tuning in. Good luck with your bets this week. Make sure to get up bright and early, because the prelims start at 10 a.m. for this one. So it's going to be a hell of a fight, card, period. So thanks for tuning in. Appreciate your support. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. And look forward to being back soon. Take care, folks.